Welcome to JPEL's Idea Handbook webinar series. I'm Sean Cole, co-editor of the handbook and one of the co-chairs of JPEL's Innovations in Data and Experiments for Action initiative. These webinars accompany the release of the handbook on using administrative data for research and evidence-based policy, funded by the Alfred P. Slow Foundation. The handbook provides a series of technical guides and case studies on how to make administrative data more accessible for research and policy. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Josh Lerner, PCRI Director and Head of the Entrepreneurial Management Unit, and the Jacob H. Schiff Professor of Investment Banking at Harvard Business School. Josh will be presenting the Private Capital Research Institute, Making Private Capital Data Accessible in an Opaque Industry. The presentation describes the establishment of the PCRI and the unique goals, data access considerations, and challenges faced when using administrative data to conduct research on the impacts of private capital on society. Josh will introduce the PCRI, discuss the barriers to research that exist in the private capital sector, and give an overview of the data and sources that the PCRI works with. The PCRI partnership with private capital is a unique application of the potential of administrative data to provide insights on the role of impact investment, firm characteristics, and the ability to link private capital data with U.S. Census data for a deeper understanding of people and firms in the economy. With that, I would like to invite you to listen to the talk.
Hello. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Private Capital Research Institute, which is an effort to make private data accessible to researchers in an opaque industry. So what we are is a nonprofit organization which essentially seeks to encourage work around private capital and the dissemination of that work. This grew out of a research initiative that we did with the World Economic Forum, and we've had the benefit of support, very generous support, from the Kaufman, Sloan, and Smith Richardson foundations. Our motivation for this effort was the fact that there were many unanswered questions about private capital. Questions that had broad implications in terms of economic policy as well as investment choices. Kinds of issues that we highlight are things about the impact of private capital investments, whether they're buyouts, venture capital, or growth financing, on the economy as a whole. What are the consequences for jobs? What are the consequences for innovation? It's not just an issue in the United States or in Europe, but it's clearly important in many other economies, including emerging markets. There are also a variety of questions around the appropriate public policies and whether it makes sense, for instance, for governments to more aggressively regulate private capital, as has happened to, in some extent, in Europe. Finally, there are a set of questions that have to do with the impact of these kinds of investments on the investors themselves. What are the returns from these investments, and how do they evolve over time? In other words, as pensions put more and more capital into alternatives, what are the realistic expectations of returns? What strategies can they take? So essentially, the answers here are important along multiple dimensions. They're important from the perspective of the institutional investors who are putting the capital work, and particularly many institutions that are doing these investments are public pensions who have liabilities for people who have worked for long times in the public sector, and where they have, as alluded to before, very real questions about how much risk they're taking on and what the appropriate return expectations should be. There's also the questions for policymakers. Many places around the world are trying to encourage entrepreneurship and early stage activity, but there often are more concerns about the proper way to treat private equity, whether it's issues around the regulatory treatment of lending from banks to private equity transactions, or whether it's tax treatment of either debt or carried interest. Finally, even for the fund managers who, in many senses are extremely knowledgeable about their own portfolios, there are, a number of ambiguities about how this industry works, what are the more defined features of it that remain largely unknown. Now, these are questions that one might thought, would have been addressed already, given that the private equity industry has been around for on the order of 80 years. But it turns out that it's far more difficult to answer many of these issues than one might think. In part, it has to do with the difficulty of getting access to data. That while there are a number of commercial data sets, particularly for doctoral students and junior faculty, it can be expensive to access these. Secondly, when one looks across the different data sets, one finds there are a considerable amount of discrepancies, which are hard to explain. In many senses, each database is a bit of a island in and of itself, and it's very difficult to try to resolve these issues. And there are also challenges around replicability, that much of the data which has been the basis of studies has been gotten on special one-time kind of arrangements, and it's difficult for another researcher to get access to that same data to do a replication study. So this is an area that is one which has a considerable amount of challenges in terms of the information. And by essentially creating data sets and making them available to researchers on a more general basis, we hope to be able to facilitate work in this area. Some of the big goals, which we have hinted at already, are to really understand what private capital's role is in the economy and society as a whole. Also, to create as much academic research using as high quality data as we can, looking across the private capital spectrum. And then finally, to diffuse those findings more generally and in particular to encourage conversations between academic and practitioner audiences around these issues. We have done a number of efforts to try to capture and share data. Clearly at the base of what we have is information at the fund level and the transaction level in terms of how much has been raised by funds, what have been their performance and cash flows, and then what has essentially happened to that money, where has it gone, and what have been the outcomes of the transactions that are done. This sort of core data has been put together from a variety of sources. There's a lot of work in terms of eliminating duplication that's taken place as a result of it. And then we've tried to take this data and move it further to help facilitate research. And in particular, there have been three key areas where we have made a push to basically make data more generally accessible. The first of these has to do with impact investing. Impact investing is essentially a class of private capital, which has gotten a lot of interest in recent years, which essentially tries to take into account both financial and non-financial objectives. And clearly, this is an area where many family offices and pensions are interested. There are a lot of questions, which is, how much of a trade-off is there between social and financial rewards? Are there particular strategies that work well? Is there sort of particularly good or bad ways to approach this? In recent months, there's been a lot of interest around diversity in private capital and how that might play in with some of these issues as well. So here we basically have tried to create as comprehensive a database on the impact investors and investments as we can. The idea is to sort of very much mirror what we've done with the main funds, so having both company and fund level data, with the understanding that by putting together this information on impact investors, it facilitates comparisons to more traditional private capital investors and allows us to answer a number of the important questions that have been raised about these investors. A second area that we have put a considerable amount of effort into in recent years has been what we're calling the Certificates of Incorporation Library. And in particular, with the help of the Sloan Foundation, we are essentially hunting down and making available these documents, which lay out, particularly for venture-backed firms, how the companies are structured and governed. They essentially have a very rich portrait of how the firms are being organized and run. These are nominally public documents, and many of them, given the fact that companies are frequently incorporated in the state of Delaware, are available with the Delaware Secretary of State, but access to them has been difficult and expensive. So what we're trying to do is create as large a library as certificates of incorporation as we can, which will essentially allow researchers to dig much more deeply into the relationships between venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and understand how they work and what the implications for innovation are. A third area that we have been very interested and excited about working on has been with the collaboration between the PCRI and the US Bureau of Census. And in particular, what the Census has done is made available to researchers under tightly controlled circumstances, of course, given the confidentiality of the information. Information both about the tax records and census responses of firms over the last several decades. And among the information that's available here is about employment, wages, the production, productivity, and a variety of other metrics that are taking place in the US economy. Normally, this has been a really valuable resource, but at the same time, it has a limitation that traditionally it's not had in the census data a lot of information about financing and how much financing is being raised at any given time. So essentially what we have done is worked out a relationship with the Census Bureau that essentially allows us to link in information about private capital investments and make that layer of information accessible to researchers who have permission to use the census data. And again, given the richness of information that the census has, this PCRI census layer with this information, both in terms of on traditional investments as well as investments by impact firms, will essentially allow a very broad set of questions to be answered that we hope will enhance our knowledge of private capital going forward. Let me say a few words about how we handle the data we're essentially, the data is developed by the staff of the PCRI. And as alluded to before, some of it is from proprietary sources and some from our own research. It's kept behind a firewall. It's made available for academics to use. We don't make it available for limited partners or investment banks and so forth. It's really focused on traditional academics who want to do research. The academics put together a proposal, which is reviewed, and then they will sign an agreement which governs the use of data. Typically the way that, just as the census data, it's essentially de-identified data that's being used, and basically the academics will extract the results, but not the data from behind. The data will stay behind the firewall during the entire process. We host all this data at the National Opinion Research Center, or NORC, at the University of Chicago. They host a lot of other very sensitive data, including Medicare and Medicaid claims data, as well as, for instance, they work with the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission and handling very confidential data from hedge funds. So they're very used to dealing both with the academics and handling highly secure data. And again, essentially the databases are de-identified. It's only the staff who has access to the identified data. There's a variety of data access procedures. And again, none of the data is downloaded off of this. As we posted on our website a data user manual, which documents a lot of what we have. Typically, people will do short proposals of 2 to 3 pages. Again, it's got to be with researchers from academic institutions, not using it for commercial purposes, but for academic research purposes. It's reviewed, and then there's a data user agreement that's signed and training to use this thing. Last topic I'll discuss is about dissemination. I think, certainly one of the challenges is not just simply doing great research, but actually getting that research in the hands of practitioners, whether they're pension funds or policymakers. So what we have done is sponsored a variety of workshops to bring together academics and practitioners to talk about topics relevant to the industry. And that's sort of been a chance to highlight some of the work that we are doing. I won't walk through at length about the topics that we have covered in these, but for instance, in recent months, we've done a workshop looking at the government policies to promote venture capital in the wake of the financial crisis, and trying to understand from both a research as well as a policymaker perspective what seems to have worked and what hasn't worked. We did a workshop looking at issues around diversity and inclusion in private capital, where again, there was a variety of research presented which documented some of these patterns, as well as a number of limited and general partners, as well as consultants who discussed some of the issues and challenges associated with advancing diversity in this field. Earlier workshops have looked at themes such as co-investments and their rise in the private capital market, again, bringing together both academics and practitioners.